So now I'm looking at the second chapter in Crisp's book, Griffin on Human Rights. This is the one by John Tasioulas. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, so my apologies to him. But Tasoulas's article is Taking Rights Out of Human Rights. And this is part one, so I'm going to do two short videos on this one. There's lots going on in this article, as usual in these philosophy articles, lots of stuff, and I'm just hitting the highlights. So once again, remember, Griffin is trying to, flesh out, give some more detail of the concept of human rights because he thinks there's they're not clear, and he wants to ground them in notions of autonomy and liberty, as we've seen. But he doesn't, of course, give much attention. That is, Griffin doesn't give much attention to a theoretical foundation for them. He wants this nice bottom-up approach, right? But Tasioulas thinks that this ends up with too much of too narrow of a basis for human rights. What he wants is a broader basis for human rights, a broader set of values, and through that we'll have more of a universal approach to human rights, broaden them out to more of a pluralist notion of the basis. And of course, the goal is, as all theories, more practical. It'll be more useful. And so he thinks also, as I'll mention, it avoids having your human rights look like they're implicitly biased in favor of one tradition over other. In this case, perhaps the more narrowly focusing on Western concepts. He wants to broaden them out so that they could, of course, be global. And he says that of course, we rehearses a lot of stuff that people talk about Griffin, that trying to look at this Enlightenment project. By enhancing, he wants to enhance the determinateness of the notion of a human right because it's too indeterminate, it's too vague. And Griffin doesn't want these top-down, the Newtonian approaches, right, too analytic or too abstract, right? And so Tasioulas wants to have a broader notion, but he thinks that Griffin doesn't really provide a rationale as to why, because he's taken it out of this theoretical context. He doesn't really give us a rationale as to why human rights properly qualify as moral rights. And it seems a little bit, kind of on shaky ground as why they're proper moral rights, because you haven't really theorized them. And this sort of this abstract nature of Griffin, despite sort of the bottom up and all this stuff, Tasioulas says, what you get is that there's an incompleteness and an arbitrariness to Griffin's account. And so Tasioulas looks at this and says, look, let's look at a couple of rejections that political theories of human rights, what they reject in Griffin's approach. Political theories of rights want to distinguish human rights from within the general class of moral rights, to provide an account of how they fit in, how they relate, how they are related to, and how they differ from. So how one species of rights, human rights, relates to other species of rights within this context of moral rights, because human rights are a species, if you like, of moral rights. But how do they differ from other species of moral rights? And he says, has no answer to this. And so it's just, you just have these human rights in virtue of being human, right? Well, that doesn't seem very satisfying to someone who has a more political theory of rights. It seems to be too abstract. So, and as Tasioulas says, human rights, they refer not just to in virtue of being human, that's not enough. They refer to these concrete political functions. So they relate to institutions. So it's too abstract to just talk about human rights simply as a person holds them in virtue simply of being a human. So that the first thing that he says is that Griffin's view is too abstract. So we've got to reject the overly abstract nature of Griffin's formulation. The second thing that he wants to say that political theories of human rights want to reject, in addition to this abstract thing, is another thing that's kind of abstract, is Griffin's notion of reason, this abstract notion of reason. So political theories of human rights say that human rights have to be justified according to public reasoning. They need to be talked about in a public context. Griffin has a narrower version, and that he says, well, look, they just need to be justified according to ordinary or natural reasoning, which again, it seems to be an abstraction from the reasoning that goes on in the real world. And it seems to be more locused like to the individual. And you just kind of think of this, but in isolation. But Tasioulas is saying that that's too abstract of a formulation. So by rejecting these two abstract sides of Griffin's formulation, so says Tasioulas, you can get you can get a more fleshed, that is, you can get a more fleshed out version of human rights, and these will help avoid what he says is kind of an implicit Western bias, that it could be too narrow or too narrowly conceived as leaning towards a certain concept, namely the Western notion of bias. Okay, so that's just the first couple of comments, and I'll return with a fresh board of stuff and pick up on some more ideas that come out of Tasoulas's taking rights out of human rights. Stay tuned.